Kevin Scarbinsky with AL.com. Good morning, Kevin. How you doing?
Hey, Kevin.
Good morning, guys. I'm great. How are you?
We're good. Kevin, about a month or so ago, maybe longer, we had you on, and I said it would be critical for Lane Kiffin. I can't believe I'm talking about Lane Kiffin, but with you, I think I want to do this. To what Nick Saban would say if the president or the athletic director picked up the phone and called and wanted to hire him.
I remember.
And so if that happened now, were things going on all year, but Nick just kind of got him out the door, was very positive about him, or did after he took the job, was there a whole bunch of other problems that happened to where now what would Nick Saban say, or would it be the same thing that he said when I asked you this the first time, if that athletic director or president called?
Well, there were, from what we understand, there were some things that went on after Lane got the job at Florida Atlantic that certainly didn't sit well with Nick Saban, and not just with Nick Saban, but with other coaches on the staff and players. Saw some things that were different about Lane Kiffin, and just to be general about it, that he wasn't 100% focused on this job, and that's hard to do when you're going into a playoff against the caliber of teams they were going to play. If you're not 100% focused on your job and you have a job as critical as offensive coordinator, then you might have some issues. And look, Nick Saban doesn't do things. He's not a knee-jerk kind of guy. He puts so much thought into every decision that for him to make that move after the Washington game told you that it wasn't just the way the game played out against Washington. It wasn't just they struggled on offense or that Jalen Hurts struggled as a passer. He struggles as a passer for much of the year. They struggled as an offense late in the year. And so it was a combination of things. And to go back to your question, it would depend. If he were trying to get him out the door, he would probably give him a positive recommendation because he wanted him out the door. And that was an easier way to do it for him to get another job. And ultimately, Alabama got what it wanted with Lane Kiffin getting another job, and they were able to hire a new offensive coordinator. But it certainly didn't work out exactly the way they wanted. And look, we'll debate this for the rest of time, whether Lane Kiffin being there Monday night would have made a difference. There's no way to know that. Look, Jalen Hurts was not going to turn into Joe Namath in a week's time, no matter who was coaching him. So, and they obviously had some other issues on offense. And how do you account for Bo Scarborough breaking a bone in his leg and going out for the last quarter and a half? So there were things that were beyond their control that I'm not sure it would have made a difference who was calling plays.
We have, fans being fans, as you know, that's because you get enough stuff. I'm sure.
I hear from them.
Yeah, I
every
understand.
day.
Situations where, a quarterback is knocked a lot. They sort of forget about the penalty that caused Clemson to be on the 2-yard line. For some reason, people have skipped that. Just give your overall view of, because I think the defensive coordinator did a good job. I like him a great deal. I was around him a little bit. Give your ideas of, and the defense, I guess, faltered a little bit about that.
Well, go back, and it was interesting, traveling back yesterday and spending a lot of downtime and on layovers at airports, just going back and looking at some of the highlights and go back and look at, and I didn't notice this at the time, and that's the value of looking at things later when you're not in the heat of the moment, you're on deadline, and you're trying to see everything and try to put it in perspective. On Clemson's second of its 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter, it was a running play up the gut to Wayne Gallman. Go back and look at that and look at Daron Payne. Daron Payne is one of the strongest guys in college football. Daron Payne regularly blows up the blockers in front of him and shoves them into the backfield. In fact, he did that in one play that stands out to me early in the game. He just blew up the Clemson blocker, threw him back about 3 or 4 yards. But on that running touchdown, Daron Payne gets thrown backwards like a rag doll, almost as if he was woozy, like he wasn't. I don't want to say blacked out or anything. I don't want to overstate it, but it was unbelievable. You've never seen Daron Payne get thrown around like a rag doll, and that's exactly what happened. Those defensive players, and I'd love to see the number of snaps that each individual player played. I'll bet you that many of those players on defense played more snaps in that game than they've ever played in a football game in their life, including guys like Jonathan Allen, guys who were in great shape. Jonathan Allen, I was told by someone who saw him, when he came off the field after Clemson's last touchdown, instead of going to the team area, he went over to where the media was standing. You know, you can only go up to the 25-yard line or so, and on each end, if you're in the media in the last 5 minutes. And Jonathan Allen just kind of wandered in like he was almost lost and almost a little woozy. Those guys, when we say gassed, when we say guys were gassed, we're not just using a cute phrase. They were empty. I mean, it was extraordinary the number of snaps they had to play. And that's a function of the offense not being able to sustain drives, not being able to make first downs. And even though Clemson, and think about this, even though Clemson didn't score much early, they were moving the ball early and they were getting first downs and they were keeping the defense on the field. Clemson scored 7 points in the first half, but ran 45 plays. That all had a cumulative effect, and that Alabama defense we saw in the fourth quarter, and especially on the last drive, was not the Alabama defense we saw all year long, because those guys were physically spent.
That's interesting stuff right there.
It is. I think people talk about them giving up 400 and something yards, but you bring a great point. If you run 99 plays to get to 400 something yards, I mean, what is the average? I would love to know what the average number of plays this year was in college football. I mean, would it have been more than 60, Kevin? In a game?
Yeah, probably. I want to say Alabama faced, I saw these numbers, and I'm not going to get them exactly right. I think that they averaged, themselves as an offense, averaged about 74 snaps a game.
Okay.
And their defense only faced about 65, 66 snaps a game on average over the course of the year. And think of this, too. One of the highlights of last year's defense, which also gave up a lot of yards and points to Clemson, obviously, was they were so deep on the defensive front. They rotated so many guys. They didn't do that as much this year. Those guys played more. Jonathan Allen played way more snaps this year than he did last year. And that was true for all of the regulars on the front. They did not have the depth up front, or they didn't trust the depth that they had up front the way they did last year. And it came back to bite them in the end Monday night.
Well, could this have been a factor? You know, I think Coach Saban knew maybe last year at the end his football team was tired. So I think it's a hard thing to do. Getting ready for the Clemson game, I think they only got in pads twice, but they didn't want to work them as hard. But I don't care if you don't do something physically, you lose your conditioning fast. So I think they were there with the balance. How much do we work them? But we got to keep them conditioned. Maybe that played a factor in it, because if they didn't quite go as hard, which they really couldn't, but it's still hard to be in condition enough for 99 plays. And I think maybe that ended up being a factor, conditioning at the end. But I don't know what they could have done differently to get ready for that.
Well, remember, to speak to that, one day last week during their preparation, one day after practice, Nick Saban had a press conference, and he was asked a question. A number of players were asked on all the playoff teams before the semifinals, were asked about expanding the playoff, which would mean playing another game if you went to 8 teams, for example. And most of the players on all 4 playoff teams said they didn't want to do that. And the Alabama players, and they were quoted by name, all talked about being gassed and spent and empty at the end of the season last year. And Reuben Foster, who's in incredible shape, who covers more ground than any linebacker I think I've ever seen. It's amazing how much ground he covers from sideline to sideline. And he made a ton of tackles on Monday night. He said he wishes they'd be more like the NFL at practice, because the NFL doesn't hit as much at practice. And I thought that was very interesting. And I asked him about that at Media Day Saturday in Tampa, and he said pretty much the same thing. And if you remember, Nick Saban was asked about Reuben's comments, and he said what he noticed from all these bowl games that he watched was terrible tackling. So you have to work on tackling, because you've been off for a month before your first semifinal game or just your bowl game for the most part. He said you got to work on tackling, because it's so bad in postseason games in general. And it is a fine line. And even though Alabama's been in the playoffs 3 straight years, they're still trying to figure out a way to strike the right balance of not burning the guys out, but making sure they get enough conditioning, making sure they get enough work on tackling so they can be physical and can be strong in the fourth quarter. It's still a work in progress, obviously, in trying to strike that balance.
Yeah.
I think Eddie Jackson's injury in the defensive secondary is a killer, wasn't it?
And when nobody, we talk about Eddie Jackson, and it is one of the coolest things that I've seen the last couple of games, the Washington game, the Clemson game, and even the SEC championship game against Florida, is Alabama fans recognizing Eddie Jackson out on the field. He's out there in warm-ups. He's out there encouraging his teammates and chanting his name. I think they recognized, and we certainly recognized, how valuable he was. They weren't not only were they not quite the same in the secondary after he went out, look at the punt return difference. He was running punts back for touchdowns, and it was almost disastrous in the Washington game against that rugby punter, and they didn't do a great job on Monday night against Clemson's rugby-style punter. Eddie Jackson was so valuable to that defense, but it didn't cost them in the regular season because they didn't face quarterbacks like Jake Browning and especially Deshaun Watson. Those were the 2 best quarterbacks they faced, with the exception of maybe Chad Kelly. Those were the 2 best quarterbacks they faced all year, and Deshaun Watson was without a doubt the best quarterback they faced all year, and that's when you really saw it show up. They really missed Eddie Jackson. He was such an important player to that team.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. They ended up putting Dieter back there, which they're just trying to find somebody that would just catch the ball, forget trying to run it and make yards. But, you're taking away an opportunity to get yards there. But they didn't trust, I guess it was Diggs who was back there. He just let the ball hit the ground too much. I know those. Dieter did scoop the ball up when it was rolling, so he did save them yards there. But I think, Eddie Jackson, how many games did he break open with a big return there? And I just don't think they ever found that return guy to replace him.
No, and then think about this, guys. And someone told me, and I didn't witness this myself Monday night, but someone told me before the last Clemson touchdown, before the pick play, Eddie Jackson was on the sideline screaming at, trying to get his teammates' attention, screaming out, "Watch the pick, watch the pick." He knew what was coming up, and I'm sure the coaches had a pretty good idea themselves.
Yeah, I don't know how do you defend the pick play? I think the officials, with the officials there, people say, well, they're not going to call it in that situation. Well, if that's a rule, that's the exact situation you have to call it, especially with the game is on the line. And so the pick allowed them to score the touchdown. If they make that call, if they back the ball up, Clemson still has an opportunity to kick the field goal, put it to overtime.
Right.
And I think Alabama's taking the high road. I'm sure Saban told them that in the locker room. We're not going to complain. But should that call have been made there? Don't tell me you're not going to call that. If that's a rule, then you call it. Should that call have been made?
It's such a fine line, and you listen to supervisors of officials. If you turn the key, one of the keys is, does the receiver setting the pick at least look back towards the ball like he's like at least attempting to run a route, and that was one part of it. And I think and does the defensive back, and obviously if you're playing man defense, you're up on the line, you're going to try to shuck the guy right off the line and throw him off his route. And is the contact initiated by the defensive player, the offensive player, or as the supervisor of officials naturally said, or is it mutually engaged? And the national supervisor of officials, Rogers Redding, told the AP yesterday he thinks they made the correct call, that it should not have been flagged because there was mutual contact between Marlon Humphrey and Artavis Scott, the Clemson receiver who set the pick. How do you defend it? First of all, after you've been burned by it the first time, maybe you don't play man defense on the goal line. Maybe you play zone. And I know that it sounds crazy to say, and it sounds crazy to question Jeremy Pruitt. He's one of the best in the business. But maybe you do that. Or what do you do in basketball? You have options. You either fight over the pick, you go under the pick, you fight over the pick, or you switch. I don't know if that's as possible in football to switch your man if you see that thing coming. But it's a brilliant play, and it's, as you said, Barry, it's almost impossible to defend if it's done right.
Yeah, well, in basketball, that would be called a moving pick. So I don't know. I don't know how you.
Hey, something else too on that play, and this was a problem. Remember, they put new turf on that field the week before the game, and I noticed a number of guys slipping during the game, and it looked to me that Scott went down in front of Marlon Humphrey on that last touchdown, and it was almost like he slipped. It looked like he was going for his legs, but I think part of it was he slipped as well. And there were a number of occasions where guys slipped during the game on that new turf.
Yeah, that.
I'll ask another football question. It seems to me like outside of Alabama and LSU that the West is a struggling West. And you can correct me. And the East, outside of the ability of Georgia to really work very hard and get some pretty good players, they didn't have a very good year this year. That it's Georgia and the rest of them a question mark. Is the league going to get any better?
Well, it needs to, and you could say Alabama wasn't as tested this year, and normally that's why the SEC won so many of those BCS championship games in a row, because by the time they got to the championship game, they had been through a gauntlet, especially the teams in the West. Just the teams they played in their division, the team they played in the SEC championship game a lot of years was a really good football team, in many cases better than the team they played in the national championship game. That was not the case this year. You saw it in the bowl games. The SEC ended up 6-7 in postseason games. That's the first time since 2002 that they had a losing postseason record as a conference. You hit it. The quarterback position was a real problem, and so when you face someone like Deshaun Watson, there aren't many guys like him in college football right now, but you didn't face anything close to that in the regular season, and when you did in Chad Kelly, he lit you up also for 400+ yards. So that's got to get better. There's some young guys with a lot of potential in the league. The guy at South Carolina, Jake Bentley, the guy at Georgia, Jacob Eason. They're Shea Patterson at Ole Miss. They have great expectations for him. Yeah, the guy at Mississippi State, I love Nick Fitzgerald. He had a really nice year this year. Everybody's expecting them to take a leap forward. The new guy coming in from Baylor at Auburn, Jarrett Stidham, they have high hopes for him. Jalen Hurts, they have high hopes that he'll continue to develop, and certainly he needs to as a passer. He'll probably be pushed by the freshman coming in, Tua Tagovailoa. That there will be competition there. And that just reminds me, guys, totally, I guess somewhat related to this. Has anyone brought up to you guys, and I've wondered about this, how might this season have played out differently for Alabama had Blake Barnett won the quarterback job? Or had they gone with Blake Barnett and used Jalen Hurts almost as Florida did Tim Tebow as a freshman, as with a special package of plays, as a change of pace? And again, that's just speculation that we can never answer definitively, but it's just interesting to think about.
Why don't you ask Nick Saban that at the next press conference, Kevin?
How many veins will pop out in his forehead before I even finish the question?
He doesn't answer hypotheticals, Kevin.
Yeah, he loves those hypotheticals, yeah.
Well, Kevin, we appreciate it, man. Great
Thank you, Kevin.
great
Always
stuff.
great.
You're awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Always enjoy talking with you.